Hello and welcome to Your Shortcut for Getting Shift Done, a video podcast brought to you by the Command Shift Company. I'm Amy Zhang, the founder of the company and your host for the podcast. Here on the podcast, we interview founders, leaders, executives, entrepreneurs of scaling organizations to figure out what truly they're doing to scale and grow, the challenges they're facing, and what the secret is they are doing to getting shift done. If you like this content, go to the Command Shift for free tools, research, articles to learn how to scale your organization. Thank you, Rahul, for joining our podcast. Rahul is a decorated GM, consultant, founder, technologist. He is here with us to just talk about his journey through foundership and what he did to be so successful in his journey. Hello, Rahul. Thank you for being here today.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me, Amy. It's a real blast to chat with you, and I know we've spoken in the past, and it's always been a really nice time. How do you want to begin?
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you think makes you a unique leader?
Yeah, I think the way I got started in entrepreneurship foundership was that I had role models that did this stuff ahead of me. My grandparents were business owners, my dad is a business owner, so I grew up surrounded by people who believed that you could put a dent in the world by starting something. And they encouraged me to look out for where are these opportunities in the world where something is broken and you have the chance to make it better. And so actually the first company I started is not on my LinkedIn or my resume. No one would ever hear about it if I didn't talk about it, and I don't frequently talk about it. But this was actually in high school, and I went to a school where you had to buy your own textbooks. They were not given to you by the school. And what I realized at the end of the year was that most people would just throw them away. And if you've ever bought textbooks at university, they're pretty expensive. And so I would go dumpster diving and get all the textbooks I could find, and then the next year resell them to the incoming class.
Oh
And
my
as a
God.
high schooler, I would make a few $1,000s. Like I think one year I made $5,000, and for like a teenage kid, that's not a little bit of money. That's your whole year's worth of outings and stuff like that. So that
So
was
did
really
you
the
ever
way I
like
got.
make something of that? I feel like they're like reseller textbook platforms now. Were you like one of the
Yeah.
first?
When I went off to college, I realized there are these really fragmented businesses that operate on every college campus doing the exact same thing. And I realized, well, I don't really want to do this. So I sort of backed away from that idea because I felt that there was a lot of fragmentation, there was a lot of competition. But that does actually take us to the next thing that I worked on, which was a company called Trendify. And so we were doing machine learning back in 2013 when no one was thinking about machine learning. And our goal was to figure out, can you predict which startups will be successful based on historical data of exits and failures and things like that.
Okay.
And it turns out our model was actually quite predictive. Like over our test data set, it would get on the order of 60 to 80% of cases right. I think some of the things that were wrong about the way we were approaching that business was we didn't talk to enough VCs to get their take on it. And what I learned in sort of going through this business for a few years was VCs don't want that, right? They don't want a general purpose model because it erodes the value of their judgment. And that's really what they're selling to their limited partners, right? They're selling, hey, I work at such and such blue chip firm. Our brand is great. We're full of smart people. You're buying us. You're not
So
buying a model
was your
that tells
target
us what to do.
audience the VCs, or was your target
It
audience
was the
selling to
VCs.
these like services to the startups?
It was the VCs. In hindsight, I got advice somewhere in the middle of the journey that said, why don't you just raise your own fund and use your technology to run your fund? Didn't end up doing that, but I'm kind of glad to see that in the market now there are funds that operate entirely on these principles that we established. Signal Fire, I think Google does this to a pretty good degree. Social Capital does this to a pretty good degree now. So it's
So
just nice to be part of the development of this very quantitative way of approaching VC, which did not really happen.
yeah, and so tell me about the people that work for you, like the people that you manage. You were saying that they're these undergrads, not that poorly paid. How did you motivate them to stay on the project?
The way someone phrased this to me earlier this week of this idea called genius kindergarten.
Okay.
And the concept is you basically go find the smartest people you can find and let them just do whatever they want within relatively loose bounds that move them in the right direction. And so, for example, we brought on another sort of engineering intern. She was in fact like a principal engineer on the project. The interview process was like highly different than what you might see in startups today. We asked like, hey, debug a piece of code in a language you've never seen before. We didn't really care about whether he could figure it out or not. We cared to see like, was there intellectual rigor there? I didn't care whether he knew the language. I didn't care whether he in fact knew how to code. And later on, I learned he had had 4 hours of computer science experience. And we asked stupid questions like, hey, teach us something we don't know in 2 minutes. And the thing he taught us was how to draw a bear on a paper plate. That was based on what are the resources in the room. He saw, oh, I see a paper plate over here. I see a marker. I'm just going to go put this together.
So
And
there's
so
a
it was
level
like
of like spontaneity and things like that.
resourcefulness, spontaneity, things like that. And the interesting thing is everyone we recruited ended up becoming wildly successful. And I did not know that would be the case back then. And so this person that I'm talking
Okay,
about.
so now looking back, if you were to reflect back and take the formula that you use to find these incredibly successful in the future people, what would that formula be?
I think some of it was just filtering for people that care a lot.
Right.
And this person basically said, or he didn't tell me in the moment, but he had 4 hours of CS experience. And he's like, I will do whatever it takes, whatever is humanly possible to deliver on what I have promised these people, which is I am good at computer science. And what I sort of independently landed on is there's this book called Talent that was written by a guy called Daniel Gross, who was a partner at YC for a while, as well as a guy named Tyler Cowen, who's a really well-known economist at George Mason. And so they co-wrote this book about their approach to talent. And really one of their central theses about this was, who can you find who is a craftsperson and they are dedicated to their craft above and beyond it being a way to make money? And so in their first chapter of the book, they say like the interview question that we always ask is, what tabs are open on your browser right now? And that's a proxy for them to figure out, do you spend your spare time developing your craft, right? Or is the job just a way to make money and support your life and have work-life balance? And let me be clear, I find nothing wrong with that. I think work-life balance is awesome. I think that if you're the sort of person who wants that out of your life, you should absolutely be entitled to it and seek it out. But I think if you're looking to have this really outsized career impact, being this really devoted craftsperson is probably the way to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of organizations need that balance, and that balance looks different for every mission that you're going to achieve. For example, like I worked on our network infrastructure in my last company, and that basically makes sure internet runs. You need a lot of people who just want to crush through work, get their things done, are really consistent, will always show up to work. Like you need a lot more people like that versus if you're in like maybe a product space. You want someone who's a little bit more creative, more challenging, more like asking questions, spontaneous. So I feel like there's always that kind of like balance to strike. And I feel like a lot of leaders and organizations struggle to find where that line is, especially when they're first starting.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. I actually have a separate book recommendation. Like what you might be gathering here is a lot of my philosophy around talent has been informed by a select group of books.
Okay.
But one that really stood out to me was this book called The Alliance by Reid Hoffman. And I can send you all these things to stick in the show notes at the end.
Okay.
But basically what this book articulates is, and it came out years ago, like over a decade ago, it basically articulated the end of the company person era where you could spend your entire life at a given company. And be well rewarded for it and get that gold Rolex and all the trappings of being the company man or woman. And so what his book describes is we've moved into a new world where companies and people that join companies are no longer a family. All of that sort of rhetoric is just that, it's rhetoric. Because what I find in a lot of performance review processes is you get this career ladder, you get all these skills, and what people want you to do is be average or exceeds expectations on everything. And I think Reid's view of the world is, in fact, you should find, the 3 to 5 skills that you're a killer at and become extremely like 3+ standard deviations good at those things. And if you're horribly weak at the other things, that's probably fine because the business can find another person to shore up those things so you don't have to deal with them. And so what I find is that if you do the performance review process that most companies do, which is, make people well-rounded, have them fit the ladder, you end up with a lot of people who are average or above average on a lot of things, rather than people who are
Exceptional
wildly
at the
good
things that
at a
are
couple
like,
things.
yeah.
Exactly.
So do you think that organizations are aware and affecting change like you're suggesting, generally speaking?
I think probably not. So I actually hosted an event on employee burnout last week at the Chief of Staff Network. And what I'm seeing more and more of is actually this force-fitting motion that companies do on the talent development side is probably a contributor to burnout. And the reason I say that is because when you make people do things they don't want to do, there's really only one tenable way of doing this, which is say it's going to be a short burst, explain the why of it, right? Like, let's say you hate being a product person and your company says to you, hey, we really need you to pinch hit on product for a quarter, right? Saying that quarter thing is actually very helpful because it time bounds it. And then indicating what the business impact of doing that is also very helpful. But ultimately,
it aligns into that mission. So they're
exactly
part of a broader goal.
Yes. And what happens though is often companies will keep stringing you along of, oh, you did so good in these 3 months that we're actually going to extend it another 3 months. Or, oh, like we haven't been able to fill the role with someone else. We really need you to keep doing it. What ends up happening when people are stuck doing roles they don't like or that don't align with their sense of craft is that's where the burnout starts creeping in.
And so how do you think, if you were to give advice or tackle this problem in the market, how would you go about addressing that with leaders?
Yeah. Again, I will turn us back to this book, The Alliance. It really did have such a massive impact on me. And it's so poorly known today, despite it being written by one of the greatest entrepreneurs out there. What he articulates in the book is what you want leaders to do is actually really invest in what is the long-term outcome of this person as a person, not just at my company. So, if I'm your manager, for example, and you tell me your goal is in 5 years, I want to be a head of ops, COO type figure, chances are there's not a home for you in that time span at our company because our COO is the co-founder and they're not going anywhere. And so a lot of people actually shy away from this conversation because they're scared about people leaving. I think especially in this market, it is if you demonstrate you care about getting people to where they want to be and accelerating them on their career journey, you will have no problem finding talent and people will work much harder for you because they know you're working harder for them.
100%.
And so, if your journey is, I want to make COO, at some company in the next 5 years, I'll start giving you COO projects, knowing full well that it will cause you to leave my company.
Right. And I also think conversely, for people who are looking for jobs, I think that's a really great indicator / red flag. If you are speaking to like a hiring manager or a leader and you're saying, hey, these are my aspirations, and they either shut it down or they say like, that's not an option in our company, versus like, okay, like these are the types of projects that I feel like we can give you to help you with your tool belt in order to get you to your goal. It's actually very interesting, this book that was written in 2014, because there's a lot of recent studies that are done in the newer generation of like Gen Z and millennials in the workforce. So I think Deloitte just came out with one, but one of the main motivating indicators that they talked about in this new generation is that they don't care about the career ladder. They don't feel at home with the company. They care about their personal journey. So their journey might be, I want to open a bakery in 10 years. And I'm in operations roles because I want to learn about finance. I want to learn about legal and compliance. I want to learn about food safety. And I already know how to bake. I don't need to learn how to cook and bake and things like that, but I want to learn about all the policies and procedures, infrastructure. I want to learn about facilities because I have to open up my own brick and mortar, things like that. They have their own personal journeys, and their jobs are just tools to supplement their personal growth. And that companies aren't really pivoting fast enough in order to accommodate this new shift. Whereas in I would say like our parents' generation, companies were homes, ladders were enticing, staying for a long period of time was normal. And so that there's like this shift that's happening, and I think that leaders and companies are a little bit slow to turn to. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And actually, I've seen that play out in my own family. As I mentioned, my dad's an entrepreneur. He's run his own business for, I think, going on 25 plus years now. My mom just completed a 10-year stint as a teacher before choosing to retire. So, there's some really long-lived tenures in our
Yeah.
parents' generation. But on the flip side, my sister is on the opposite side of this generational divide between millennial and Gen Z. We're fairly far apart in age. And so she's in the early days of college, and I see the exact same thing, right? There's not this grasping for the career ladder that I think was somewhat more endemic to millennials, where even starting college, I had this plan, right, in my head of, I think I'm going to do these things, and doing those things are going to get me on the stepping stones to doing these other things. And I was very methodical about that. And I think my sister is not that way at all. I think she basically says, I care about learning these things, and then I'll figure out what comes next. And it's this notion of, I'll land where I land, and then I will reposition myself from there. And I don't know if this was your experience as well, but I was much more of a planner and thinking like, what are the stepstones that get me across the hopscotch or the river to wherever I want to go?
Yeah, I mean, for my experience, I felt that I didn't ask that many questions. It was
Hmm.
like society is telling me to do
Yeah.
these 10 steps, and I'm doing
Yeah.
them to the best of my ability. But I feel like right now, not just Gen Z, I feel like the world kind of has
Yeah.
woken up a little bit. I think COVID challenged people's norms, shaken things up a bit. I think a bunch of the layoffs has also questioned longevity, because it's like, well, how could you lay off me? I was here for 10 years. And so people are viewing work completely differently than they did before. And questions are coming up a lot more, which I think is why companies also need to deliver more transparency than they did before. And that's also another shift, where just like people value that communication, that transparency. I think activism is bigger than it has been in the past too, of employees' expectation for their employer. So there are a lot of different dynamics that are changing, I feel like, with the employee-employer relationship, that I don't know if companies really see right now. So why don't we talk a little bit about your experience building businesses? So you've had extensive experience building, running, operating, selling businesses.
Yep.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about that journey? What made you choose that path, and how did you learn how to do it?
So we talked about sort of the first two experiences, and I sort of alluded to the fact that Trendify, the first company, failed because I couldn't find customers. And that gave me this really serious crisis of confidence. And I decided, okay, I'm going to go do what every other business student does and go get a job in consulting. And so I landed at a company called Fahrenheit 212 that got acquired by Capgemini, which is one of the massive global consultancies. And basically, we did product R&D and product strategy, and that was sort of our core niche, but we were sector agnostic. And typically our projects were like sprint length, not years long length. So I could be doing, a food company, something you'd see at the grocery, in 1 month. And then I might be working for one of the, sexy novel apps that you use every day, and then a pharma company the next day after that. And so I was there for 2 years. I became their youngest. I was hired as an analyst, became their youngest associate ever. And over that time, I think I worked on 12 or 14 projects, which is really uncommon in consulting world,
Mhm.
because most people do these 6 to 12 month projects. And since I was doing a lot of sprints, I just got a lot of reps in. And my last project was for a company owned by a celebrity. This person was very demanding, and so I ended up working 100 and 20 hours over 9 days. And I was sleeping on the couch in the office, and I'm like, okay, this is horribly fucked. I need to move on. You can bleep that out, I assume, or keep it, whatever you like. And I tried to start getting into tech, and people weren't taking me seriously because that was back in the days when consultants were still looked down upon, right? No one cared about MBAs or consulting or banking in tech. And of course, a lot of that has changed now, and all of that is really well sought after. But I went back to school. I went to a coding boot camp so that I could be more technical and speak the
So
lingo.
many people do that.
Yeah. Although, should I admit this in public? I will. I found a loophole in their contract, and I haven't paid a dime. That was a nice free year of education for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll ask you maybe offline about what this loophole is.
Yeah, we can talk about it. Then I landed at my first sort of real startup gig, not something that I was running and, having middling success with. It was a company called Newfront. They were building sort of the insurance brokerage of the future. And I got to work on part of their business was doing buyouts of other brokerages. And so I got to work on one of their buyout teams for my first little stint there. And then I worked on their general biz ops team, mainly focused on process improvement, automation, outsourcing, analytics, all that kind of stuff. We went from, this was my biggest project there. In one quarter, we documented 50 common processes at the business, built them out in software so that every step would be tracked, documented. We would know the rework rates. We would know the time to completion. We would know who was great at a given process. We would know who was bad at a given process. And then from there, we could figure out which processes were creating bottlenecks for everybody, outsource them, automate them, et cetera. And then thereafter, I joined, this was more towards COVID, the beginning of COVID. And then I joined a competitor as their first BizOps hire, still in the insurtech space, but doing even more esoteric forms of insurance. Things like, insuring stem cell research facilities and axe throwing facilities, and weird things that are so risk on that it's very hard for them to get insurance. And yeah, so I was there, and basically I was in that BizOps manager role for my first 6 or so months.
Were you one of the first BizOps people?
I was the first BizOps person, yeah.
How did you find that they valued that position?
In terms of salary, or what are we
talking
about?
In terms of how did they identify that they even needed that? And then who said, you're going to work on this project? Meaning this is a huge project, documenting, implementing software. Someone had to really think, you know what, we want to invest in this. This really is a need in our organization. And we're going to go hire a full person to go do that.
Yep. So
it's for being a first hire in any kind of department or new function. Yep. How did you engage with incredibly technical people or people that are working on something completely different?
So most of my roles I've actually gotten off social media.
Okay.
Twitter. I mean, before the Twitter algorithm was busted, now I think the algo would not help me get a new job, but when I said I was job searching, one of the co-founders of this company saw that I had changed my Twitter bio or something, or that I had tweeted, "Hey, I'm on the market again." And he's like, "Hey, I know your prior company. We have investors in common, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want to do the same kind of work for us?" And, it was the middle of COVID. I'm like, yeah, probably. I should probably get a new job sooner rather than later. And so that's how he found me. And then basically my initial work was I got embedded in the sort of operations customer success team. And my job was to look at what they were doing and figure out how to make it better. And some of the projects would come down from the COO. Some of them I would just see and then pitch the company. And so, for example, one of them was we were sending contracts as PDFs that would then have to be wet signed and faxed back to us. I'm like, that is idiotic. We're an insurance company. We process hundreds of contracts a day. Yeah. That is not acceptable.
Right.
And so I figured out what is a cheap offering that lets us templatize some of these contracts, send them out for e-sign, and then automatically log them back into Google Drive and Salesforce and things like that. And so that was a project I pitched that we got done in the span of a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. And then a project that was given to me was, hey, we have no way of billing our customers. I joined this company at $0 of revenue. We have no way of billing our customers. And we also don't have what in the insurance world is called an agency management system. So can you go find one of those and implement it? And so that was a 2-quarter long vendor selection and implementation extravaganza. And
That's a tough one.
that was a tough one. That was a tough one. And I had done some of that at the prior company. And I think that experience was what made it a little bit easier for me. But yeah, that was sort of what I did in my first 6 months at the company. And then I got tapped to become chief of staff. As chief of staff, I took over basically all of our back office, our regulatory compliance, finance, HR, IT. And I would basically just coordinate an army of contractors that we had hired to do some of these things and oversee that the quality was there, and then run it past our lawyers that we weren't like running afoul of any regulations or anything like that.
Yeah.
Um,
So tell me a little bit about like what are your lessons in terms of like scaling and building and implementing?
there is this trap in both the biz ops and chief of staff world that you do this work, you demonstrate that you're good at it, and then you keep it. And my advice is don't keep it, get rid of it. Find a cheaper person to take on the work or outsource it completely in a way or automate it. And the trouble for me was that I was satisfactory at a lot of these things. You know, I would get the job done to a degree that was acceptable. I will not say I was the greatest accountant in the world.
Right.
Definitely not. I did very poorly in my accounting classes. But, you know, I ended up accumulating 3 or 4 people's worth of work. That was crushing after a while. Like I got back to that mode of I was working 80+ hour weeks.
Right.
Really struggling to prioritize and things like that. After a few years at that company, I sort of moved back to kind of general ops, but also a little bit rev ops. And I did that for a bit. And then I chose to leave because I was so burnt out by the amount of work I was doing that even though I really believed in the company, I did not feel that there was a way for me to resolve the burnout, especially given that this was like in the post-COVID sort of getting into economic turmoil era. Like it didn't make sense for them to keep someone who might go on sabbatical for a while to try and replenish themselves. And so we came to a conclusion that they were very generous about. I won't disclose exactly what the terms were, but we found something that worked for both of us. And then I basically left. And as I was divvying up what I was doing, it actually did take 3 people to take on all of the work.
Wow.
It was a lot. And really, I've started to actually move a little bit into this mode of how can I protect my time a little bit more? The reason for that is I'm also planning my wedding right now. So that does demand my time a little bit better and more. Yeah, thank you. And so I landed at Chief of Staff Network because I was a member for a while. And I'd known the founder, his name is Scott, and Scott basically wanted to step back from the day-to-day operations a little bit. He basically said like, hey, I saw you've been working on sort of talent development, courses, etc., for strategy and ops folks. I'd like to buy that IP off of you. And then do you want to join us as a sort of full-time general manager and lead the company day to day in my stead? And that's how I've landed here. And I've been on the team here for about a year.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So we are actually running against time. So any like last words of advice for people who are, or founders who are scaling their organization, what you should think about in this economy, society, how we should think about tech, according to Rahul?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the way that people should think about scaling is typically the founders should do the function themselves until it's running, like it's humming along. It doesn't need to be 100% optimized. But, you know, we talked a little bit before in writing about when does a founder think about scaling up a back office function or a sales function or something like that? And my view is the founder basically needs to break themselves on that function, like it's too much work for them to do, and then they can hire a new person. Because otherwise you're increasing your cost basis too much without being able to sort of justify it. And the thing that's happening right now in the market, the salaries still haven't rebalanced themselves. And so people are still expecting the 2015 to 2021 salary of like, oh, I was at Fang making 300K, or I was at a Series C startup making like 200 and then a really fat amount of equity. And so I think that is what is to come in the market, is the salaries will probably rebalance some. Because of that, that's what's putting pressure on the founders or the early hires, that you need to be doing probably enough work to fill your own self as a manager, and then fill probably 50 to 60% of the next hire. And don't do it forever. Like, do it for a quarter, and once you can justify that next spend, then go hire the person.
That's great advice. Well, thank you so much, Rahul, for your valuable insights and your time today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and
Yeah.
we'll see you on the next one.
Awesome. This was super fun. Thank you for having me. And I'm looking forward to watching future episodes.
Awesome. All right. Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
See you later.